Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we are almost done with our enlightenment, imperialism, nationalism unit. So today we are finishing up chapter 7. So let's get into it. It's a shorter lecture, comparatively smaller than the one about Africa, because I know that one was big. So here we go. Chapter 7, lesson 4, imperialism in Latin America. So let's get into it. That was your warm-up. Okay, objectives. We're going to explain the importance of the Panama Canal, describe the events leading up to the Mexican Revolution, and make generalizations about economic growth in Latin America. All right, like a good neighbor. So in the 1800s, the U.S. began to intervene in the affairs of its southern neighbors to secure its strategic interests in raw materials for its industries. In 1895, a writer and journalist, Jose Marti, returned to Cuba after years of exile. Marti helped form the Cuban Revolutionary Party in 1892 and began organizing a rebellion against the Spanish rule. He teamed up with a group of revolutionary generals and invaded Cuba in April 1895, but Marti was killed in battle by the Spanish the next month. The brutality in which the Spanish Crusted Rebellion shocked Americans and began a series of events for the U.S. to declare war against Spain in 1898. And it was a quick war, easily won by the United States. And as a result of the Spanish-American War that ensued, and we won, Cuba became a U.S. protectorate. Similarly, the treaty that ended the war, Puerto Rico, also in Latin America, was annexed by the United States. In 1903, U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt supported a rebellion that allowed Panama to separate from Colombia to establish a new nation. In return, the U.S. was granted control of the 10-mile strip of land through the country. There, the U.S. built the Panama Canal, which opened up in 1914. It was one of the world's greatest engineering feats of its time. The canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and on average, it takes a ship about 8 to 10 hours to move through the canal passage. So the U.S. gets involved in Latin America. That's the imperialism factor, okay? We support revolutions so that we can get our cookie when the regimes crumble. That was a horrible analogy, but when have I never been corny? That's Jose Marti, R.I.P. These are the territories that the U.S. got after the Spanish-American War, which we've talked about. So you got Puerto Rico. I don't know why it's spelled that way. It's Puerto Rico. All right, and this is Theodore Roosevelt digging up his own Panama Canal. It says, the man who can make the dirt fly. This is the building of the Panama Canal. More building of the Panama Canal. All right. Like a good neighbor, America is there. 1904, President Roosevelt further expanded American involvement in Latin America. At the time, European powers threatened to send warships to Santo Domingo and the Dominican Republic to collect debts owed to them, which is right. Okay, if you don't pay, give us our money, or we'll send our army. And so, in a statement that became the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, if you recall, the Monroe Doctrine stated that the Americas were off limits to any European country trying to colonize or recolonize. You could still keep your land, but further colonial development was not allowed. So Roosevelt makes a corollary in addition to the Monroe Doctrine that he claimed the U.S. would intervene in any part of Latin America guilty of chronic misconduct, such as the inability to repay debts. The U.S. then took control of the debt collection of the Dominican Republic and locals as well. American investments in Latin America will soon expand. In the 1900s, the U.S. began to pursue what is called dollar diplomacy, extending its influence by investing in Latin American development. Although this policy appeared to be for the benefit of Latin American countries, it was also meant to secure control over the finances and raw materials of Latin America for the United States only. The U.S. soon replaced Europe as a source of loans and investments. Direct U.S. investments reached $3.5 billion out of the world total of $7.5 billion during this time period. So, heavy investment in Latin America. As American investments grew, so too did the resolve to protect those investments. The U.S. sent military forces to Cuba, Guatemala, Mexico, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic to protect those American interests. Some expeditions stayed for years. For example, U.S. Marines in Haiti were stationed there from 1915 to 1934, and Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933. Increasing numbers of Latin America began to resent the interference from the big bully to the north. So we might have called ourselves Big Brother, but oh, brother, were we not. So here you got Teddy Roosevelt, as he famously made a quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." It's also called his big stick diplomacy. And here you have this dollar diplomacy. Here's a machine gun. Another one. So, another revolution. After 1870, large landowners in Latin America began to take a more direct interest in national politics and even governing it too. So in Argentina and Chile, landholding elites controlled the governments, adopted constitutions to those like the US and European countries, but as being ruling elites of the upper class, they limited voting rights. In some countries, large landowners supported dictators who looked out for the interests of the ruling elite. One such man, Porfirio Diaz, who ruled Mexico from 1877 to 1911, created a conservative, centralized government. The army, foreign capitalists, large landowners, and the Catholic Church all supported Diaz. All these groups benefited from their alliance with Diaz, but growing forces for change, nationalism, and democracy, right, led Mexico to have a revolution. This is different than Mexican independence. So during Diaz's dictatorial reign, the wages of workers declined. 95% of the rural population owned no land, whereas almost 1,000 families owned almost all of Mexico. A large percentage of Mexico's land was also owned by foreign investors, most of them American companies. This was seen as unjust, especially by tenant farmers called campesinos. So a moderate landowner, a guy named Francisco Madero, forced Diaz from power in 1911, and the door to a wider revolution then opened. And they got more than what they could chew off. Let's just say that. So this is Porfirio Diaz. This is a painting of Diaz and being this, like looking like a monopoly, right? Taking money from foreign investors. That's Pancho Villa. We'll talk about him soon. And this is Francisco Madero. And that's another picture of Francisco Madero. Here's his picture right here. It says El Grito, 450 years of fighting the people of Mexico. But those are natives. Again, Francisco Madero, when he entered as the president. Here are campesinos. Lots of pictures. Am I right? All right, complete chaos. Like the stuff we're about to talk about, it's pretty crazy if you don't know Mexican history. So unpopular with both liberals and conservatives, Madero made a valiant effort to handle the revolutionary forces. He put some of his best officials in his administration. He sought a balance between in dealing with foreign interests. But before Madero's efforts could even come to fruition, his government was overthrown by a guy named General Victoriano Huerta in 1913. Huerta was backed by the US and conservatives who wanted a return to the old order. So Huerta's coup put an end to Madero's reforms. So this guy, Madero, is trying to limit the amount of foreign influence in Mexico. He's trying to nationalize industries, meaning the Mexican government takes ownership and kicks out the foreign investors. And the US government being like, hey, we're losing money and influence in Mexico. We're going to send a guy who doesn't want that, who wants to be on our side, also get some of the profit, but be on our side where we can make more money. And this Madero guy, he's trying to take that away from us. So we can't let that happen. That's why Huerta goes and ousts Madero. But a coup d'etat is a coup d'etat, and not everyone likes a coup d'etat. The coup was deeply unpopular and resulted in a revolutionary uprising. Huerta was rapidly removed from power in 1914 by a coalition of revolutionary forces. But again, these forces failed to agree on Mexico's future, and the country erupted into basically a civil war. There were three sides, led by Pancho Villa in the north, Emiliano Zapata in the south, and another guy, Venustiano Carranza. Venustiano. Villa's center of power was located in Mexico's northern states and generally favored reforms that benefited Mexico's working class, landless peasants. His army dominated the countryside and even led an excursion in New Mexico, which angered the U.S. This is at the time right before World War I starts, and our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, went on a little escapade trying to find Pancho Villa. I believe like 50 or I think 30 people were killed by Pancho Villa in New Mexico. So naturally, America did not like him. Villa's ideas, such as a Mexico of citizen soldiers, were very radical. That is Victoriano Huerta. That is our guy Pancho Villa. Everyone likes him. That is Carranza. And that is Emiliano Zapata. This is a picture that I found where like Villa and Carranza are fighting. And here's Huerta. And there's an Orozco. And they're all fighting for Mexico City. I don't see, I think that's Zapata in the back. So this is Uncle Sam. Came into New Mexico, and this is Pancho Villa running back to Mexico. And Uncle Sam said, I've had about enough of this. Civil War. So Emiliano Zapata led radicals' calls to reform and redistribution of land. He also resisted Madero's government for not going far enough to ease the burdens of the campesinos. Centered in Mexico's southern states, Zapata had for years aroused the masses of campesinos, seized and redistributed the estates of wealthy landowners to the peasants. Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa were working for similar goals, although their centers of power were in opposite regions of Mexico. But the two generals made natural, if somewhat reluctant, allies. From 1914, 1915, they came together to resist the third general, Venustiano Carranza. More about Carranza. Born into a wealthy family of landowners, Carranza was more politically moderate than Villa or Zapata, so he's more in the middle on the political spectrum. Born into a wealthy family of landowners, I just said that, Carranza hoped to ease the sufferings of the poor in Mexico while at the same time trying to maintain property rights of most landowners. Although his army was smaller than both Villa's or Zapata's, Carranza was assisted by brilliant generals. Carranza defeated Villa's army in 1915, and Zapata's forces were steadily reduced and finally defeated in 1919. Carranza's forces were now the dominant army in Mexico, and Carranza would go on to head a new Mexican government. Zapata would fight on and would be ambushed and killed by forces loyal to Carranza in 1919. Villa would continue on leading resistance to Carranza, only agreeing to lay down his arms in 1920, but he would be assassinated in 1923. So, RIP to both of these leaders. Because if you're a radical revolutionary who goes against the leader, you're probably going to get killed. It is what it is. So this is Pancho Villa. I think this picture is called Villa en la Silla. So there's Villa, and that's Zapata. Zapatista, all those. So this is Carranza. This is a dead Zapata and people posing with his dead body. And that's Pancho Villa after he got shot. Said he got shot 15 times. So, and one of them were the people in the car riding with him. So kind of messed up, right? So now Carranza, this is a picture, a painting. Carranza is the leader of Mexico. Or is he? Constitución Nueva. I think I put that right. Following Carranza's victory, a new constitution was enacted in 1918, and Carranza was elected Mexico's president. This new constitution put in place many of the non-radical goals of the revolution. It set up a government led by a president elected by universal male suffrage. Typical. It created land reform policies, established limits on foreign investors, and set an agenda to help workers. It included rights of workers to form unions, set a minimum wage, and limited working hours. Between 1910 and 1920, the Mexican Revolution caused great damage to the Mexican economy, though the revolution helped bring about a more democratic and politically stable Mexico. But ultimately, the Mexican Revolution was a conflict with social and economic roots. Inequality and excessive foreign influence resulted in resentments among Mexico's landless poor, bubbled into a decades-long chaotic struggle for the soul of the nation. This revolution led to an awakening of nationalism and an outpouring of patriotism throughout Mexico. National pride was evident as intellectuals and artists sought to capture what was unique about Mexico's special emphasis on its past. So, you know, you have a new Mexico. You go from Porfirio Diaz to Francisco Madero, to Victoriano Huerta, to Zapata and Villa versus Carranza. I mean, this all happened. That's why I call it chaos, because literally you had 5 different leaders within 10 years. It's wild. It's wild. Wild, wild west. Dependency. So after 1870, Latin American countries began an age of prosperity based on a large extent on the export of a few basic items and cash crops. These included wheat and beef from Argentina, coffee from Brazil, coffee and bananas from Central America, sugar and silver from Peru. These foodstuffs and raw materials were largely exchanged for cheap finished goods, textiles, machinery, luxury items from Europe and the United States. The abundance and low cost of these European and American goods often placed local Latin American industries at a disadvantage because it's cheaper to import American goods than it was to buy stuff made in Guatemala or even Cuba. After 1900, the Latin American countries looked to increase their own industrial capacity. They built factories to produce textiles, foods, and construction materials, but the growth of the Latin American economy mostly remained on the export of raw materials. As a result, Latin America, LA, just so you know, LA is Latin America, not Los Angeles, Latin America, remained economically dependent on Western nations and their foreign investment, and investment from the U.S. especially grew after 1900. Despite its economic growth, Latin America was still an underdeveloped region of the world. Old patterns still largely prevailed in Latin American societies, like rural elites dominated their estates and workers. Slavery had been abolished in 1888, but former enslaved people and their descendants were at the bottom of society. And of course, indigenous peoples were largely poverty-stricken. Growth, though, One result of prosperity increased exports was the growth of the middle sectors of Latin American society. Lawyers, merchants, shopkeepers, business people, school teachers, professors, bureaucrats, military officers were increased in numbers. As a result, as in Europe and the United States, these groups were mostly settled in urban areas. For example, cities like Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and Lima expanded as these areas industrialized. Regardless of the country in which they lived, middle-class Latin Americans shared some common characteristics. They lived in cities and sought education and decent incomes and looked to the U.S. as a model, especially regarding industrialization. Middle class sought liberal reform, not revolution. And once they had the right to vote, they usually sided with the landholding elites. So as Latin American export economies boomed, the working class too grew, as well as labor unions, especially after 1914. Radical unions advocated for the use of the general strike as an instrument for change, meaning every industry, every company, if you're building ships, you're building railroads, everyone goes on strike. That's a general strike. By and large, the governing elites were still able to stifle these political influences of the working classes by, guess what? Limiting the right to vote. The need for industrial workers also led Latin American countries to seek immigrants from Europe. So between 1880 and 1914, 3 million Europeans, primarily Italian and Spanish, settled, for example, in Argentina. And likewise, as in Europe and the United States, Latin American industrialization led to urbanization, people moving from the rural countryside to cities. So Buenos Aires, nicknamed the Paris of South America, had about 750,000 inhabitants by 1900, and in 1914, 2 million by that time. Over half of Argentina's population lived in the cities. So that concludes. Oh, here we got pictures of America, Bill of Fare. So this is after the Spanish-American War, and you got Uncle Sam. This is President McKinley at the time, and Uncle Sam's like, I wonder what I don't know what I'll take first: the Sandwich Islands, Puerto Rico pig, or the Cuba steak. And this is a very a political cartoon of Uncle Sam being a teacher trying to civilize the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And if you look, these are the states that were gathered up during the was in the Mexican-American War. You got Texas and California. Look, they're all nicely doing, paying attention. You got the Native American who has a ABC's book upside down. And you got the representative of slaves at the time. African Americans weren't, we had segregated schools at this time. So again, political cartoon. And that is going to conclude our little, hold on, I need to get the book. That's going to conclude our lecture. If I only had this book in front of me at all times. So let's see. There we go. All right, so your homework is going to be page 283, 2 through 4. Page 283, 2 through 4. Okay, so a little bit shorter, heavy on the Mexican Revolution, because, we love a revolution in world history. So, yeah, don't forget, do your homework, and hopefully you guys did enjoy that. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Burrs.